My name is Hazel Carter, and I am 70 years old. That night, something happened that made me realize I could no longer stay invisible in my own life. I had spent decades putting others first, raising my son, sewing, saving, giving more than I sometimes even had to give. But that evening, I faced a moment I had been avoiding for years. I remember the air in the dining room, thick with the smell of vanilla pudding, the glimmer of crystal glasses under the light, and the polished silverware reflecting the warm glow. I had hoped for a simple, peaceful dinner, a chance to see my son smile and maybe enjoy a quiet evening with his wife, Kendra. But as soon as she arrived in that red dress, perfectly styled, her eyes scanning the room with an almost predatory precision, I felt it, the tension I had been brushing off for months. There was a moment when her words cut through the room like ice, and I froze, spoon in hand. I realized, in that instant, that all the sacrifices, all the quiet help I had given, were invisible to the very people I loved most. My son, Daniel, avoided my gaze, fingers nervously tapping his phone, as if it could hold the answers or excuses that I had been missing. I want you to imagine how it feels to carry someone else's burdens quietly, to stretch every dollar, every minute, every ounce of patience, hoping that one day it will be appreciated, only to have it dismissed in a single moment. That night, I finally understood that I had a choice, not just to give, but to stand for myself. And that choice changed everything. As I set the spoon down and steadied my voice, I knew the dinner would not end as planned. The night was about to reveal truths that had been hidden for months, and it would mark the beginning of a journey I had almost forgotten I deserved. From here, I want to take you back to how I got to that moment, to the years of quiet sacrifice and the small acts of love that I thought were enough. Because the story of that night only makes sense if you know everything I carried before stepping into that dining room. I have lived in the same small town in Ohio for over 30 years. After my husband passed, I poured myself into raising my son, Daniel, and building a quiet life around the people I loved. I spent decades sewing dresses, hemming pants, patching coats, saving every penny, and giving more than I sometimes had to spare. My hands carry the proof of those years calloused from love and labor, from making life easier for others while often ignoring my own needs. When Daniel first came to me with the news that he had lost his job and couldn't pay rent, my heart didn't hesitate. I believed in helping, in protecting him, in keeping his pride intact. I opened my savings account, the money I had gathered over years of careful planning, and began covering their rent $900 every month, plus $100 for the landlord's processing fee, a full $1,000 disappearing from my account like clockwork. I told myself it was temporary, a small sacrifice for my son's comfort, though it meant I skipped meals, stretched my medicine, and wore shoes until the soles split. I believed he and Kendra would recognize the effort someday. That gratitude would follow sacrifice. Instead, I watched them go on dinners, buy new clothes, and post pictures of trips I couldn't afford for myself. And I stayed silent, because mothers are supposed to sacrifice, aren't they? But deep down, I began to feel the weight of invisibility, of a life devoted to others at the cost of my own. Every corner of my house holds memories of those sacrifices, the rocking chair that once held me through nights of Daniel's fevers, the quilt stitched from scraps of fabric left over from my work, each square a fragment of my love. I thought that helping my family was the same as loving them, until I realized that sometimes Helping too much can erase your own presence until you barely recognize yourself. I want you to understand why that dinner mattered so much. It wasn't just about Kendra's words or Daniel's avoidance. It was the culmination of decades of love, patience, and unseen work. That night, I carried all of that into the dining room, hoping for peace, but knowing deep inside that the calm before the storm was only a moment. And as I set the table, recalling every meal I had made with care and every time I had chosen their comfort over my own, I felt a strange mixture of pride, fear, and anticipation. Little did I know, the moment Kendra's words hit the table, it would not just shatter the evening, it would shatter the quiet expectations I had built around myself for years. The evening began quietly, with me arranging Daniel's favorite dishes on the table: chicken with mushroom sauce, rice with vegetables, and the vanilla pudding he had loved since childhood. I wanted everything to feel warm, inviting, like the home I had worked so hard to keep full of care and memories. Every glass, every piece of silverware, every folded napkin carried more than practicality. It carried my hope for a peaceful evening. When Kendra arrived, I noticed the red dress first. It was beautiful, expensive, and deliberate. Her presence seemed to fill the room, her movements precise, as if every glance and gesture had been rehearsed. I watched her eyes scan the table, lingering on me just long enough for me to feel noticed and dismissed at the same time. Daniel sat stiffly beside her, avoiding my gaze, tapping his fingers against his phone like he was waiting for something, though I knew he was avoiding responsibility. As the meal progressed, I felt the familiar tension creeping in. Kendra's comments were subtle at first, almost casual observations about the room, the food, the outdated decor, but they carried an edge, a comparison to her mother that I had sensed in her eyes long before the words came. My heart sank, but I kept my voice steady, reminding myself that I had survived worse, that I was not invisible in this room, even if they acted as though I were. Dessert arrived, the vanilla pudding I had prepared with care. I thought for a brief moment that perhaps the evening could end peacefully. That thought shattered when Kendra's words hit. Slicing the air as sharply as a knife, I realized she saw me not as family, not as someone who had given years of love, but as inferior, inadequate, somehow replaceable. I felt the spoon freeze in my hand. The quiet that followed was almost suffocating. Daniel's head stayed down, shoulders tense, as if pretending not to hear could undo the truth. And in that pause, I made a choice that I had avoided for years. I would no longer be silent. I remembered every penny, every sleepless night, every sacrifice that had kept them comfortable. I reminded myself that my love had always been unconditional. But unconditional love does not mean erasing oneself. I calmly let them know that the rent I had been covering would now become their responsibility. I told myself to keep my voice even, but there was a weight behind every word, a power that I had almost forgotten I possessed. The moment Daniel realized what I had been doing, his face drained of color. Kendra's confident mask faltered. The truth I had carried quietly for months now hung between us like a tangible presence, undeniable and unavoidable. The air shifted. For the first time in years, I saw them confronted with reality, the one reality I had been living quietly for so long. Shame and surprise replaced their arrogance, and in that room, heavy with silence, I began to feel something unfamiliar clarity. I had stepped out of invisibility, and the evening had taken a turn none of us could have predicted. As the meal ended, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief. I had done what I had feared, and the tension had not broken me. It had awakened me. The next steps, the reconciliation, or the fallout, were still unknown. But I knew that from this moment forward, nothing would be the same. After the confrontation at the table, something inside me shifted. I realized I had spent too many years bending, compromising, and smoothing over conflicts to keep the peace. I had allowed my love to be used as a shield for their irresponsibility, and I finally understood that love without boundaries can become a cage. That night, I made a decision I had never dared to make before I would stop being the invisible caretaker and start standing for myself. I thought back to the months of quietly paying their rent, the careful budgeting, the skipped meals, and the aches I ignored. Every act of sacrifice had been made out of love, but it had also been invisible to them. Now, for the first time, I let myself acknowledge the unfairness of it all. I recognized that protecting Daniel's pride had often meant erasing my own dignity, and I knew that I could no longer allow that to continue. Standing there, watching the weight of truth settle between us, I felt an unfamiliar calmness. I had confronted the disrespect, and the silence that followed carried not shame for me, but for them. I realized that empowerment doesn't come from anger alone. It comes from clarity and from claiming your own worth. I allowed myself to feel proud of the boundaries I had set and the courage it took to speak up. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life. For the first time in years, I considered my own needs, my own happiness, and the life I had postponed for the sake of others. I thought about the dreams I had tucked away, small adventures, quiet joys, the possibility of reconnecting with old friends I had lost touch with, and I felt a flicker of hope, the kind that quietly reminds you that life can still hold surprises, even at 70. I also began to see Daniel differently. The confrontation had shaken him, and I sensed the first glimmers of accountability. He had never had to face the consequences of his choices so clearly, and now he had no escape. And while I knew growth takes time, I could sense that this moment was planting the seeds for change, for him to step into responsibility rather than rely on my sacrifices. As the evening wound down, I walked through my home, touching the quilt on the sofa, the rocking chair in the living room, the polished glasses in the cabinet, and felt a sense of reclaiming. These objects had always been part of my story, my labor, my love, and now I understood that they also symbolized the strength and resilience I had carried all along. In that quiet reflection, I began to imagine a future beyond this tension, one where my life was not defined by others' expectations, where I could pursue joy, reconnect with old loves, and rediscover the parts of myself I had set aside. That night marked the end of invisibility and the beginning of self-respect. A couple of days after that dinner, my phone rang just as the sun was dipping behind the trees. It was Tom Carson, a name I hadn't heard in decades. My college sweetheart, the boy with the crooked smile who had once promised to take me to the Pacific Ocean. Hearing his voice felt like opening a window in a room I hadn't realized had been closed for 50 years. He told me about his life in Seattle, the family he had raised, and the work he had done building a company from the ground up. And then he mentioned something that made my heart skip, a photograph of me he had found among old keepsakes, a memory frozen in time. He wanted to reconnect, to see if I was still in Ohio, to hear my voice again. I felt a strange mix of excitement and hesitation. wondering if the woman I had become could step into a connection that had been paused for so long. I thought about the risks, the distance, the age, the fear that nostalgia might cloud my judgment. But I also considered the possibilities, the chance to rediscover joy, adventure, and companionship that was entirely mine to claim. I weighed these thoughts carefully, writing down the risks and the safeguards, ensuring that if I went, it would be on my terms. And then I asked myself the hardest question: was I considering this to punish Daniel and Kendra? Or was I considering it for me? The truth settled quietly in my chest. This choice was about reclaiming my life, about stepping into a chapter I had been too afraid to write. I realized that happiness is not a gift handed to us by others. It is something we must actively choose. In that moment, I felt a kind of exhilaration I hadn't experienced in years. The thought of exploring Seattle, walking along the Pacific, and simply being Hazel again, not just a mother, a caretaker, or someone's safety net, filled me with a quiet but undeniable excitement. I knew that life had a way of surprising us when we finally step forward for ourselves. And as I closed the notebook and whispered to the darkened room that I was not running away, but choosing myself, I felt a release I hadn't known I needed. The next chapter awaited, and for the first time in decades, it felt entirely possible to embrace it. Soon after, Daniel approached me, different from the nervous, evasive son I had known. He had begun to take responsibility for his own life. I could see the change forming, tentative but real. And that, more than anything, made me realize that standing up for myself didn't close doors, it opened them. Not just for me, but for the people I loved in ways they couldn't have imagined. A week later, I found myself standing in my bedroom, suitcase open on the bed, filled with clothes I had chosen for myself, not for anyone else. Coral pink dresses I had sewn just for this journey. Items I had postponed buying or wearing for decades. Daniel had driven me to the airport, and for the first time, our conversation was quiet, honest, and free of the tension that had always shadowed us. I could see him beginning to understand that my love did not mean endless sacrifice, and perhaps, in this understanding, he could start to find his own footing. On the plane, I opened the letter he had pressed into my hand, a note written in his unsteady handwriting. He had expressed his commitment to change, to take responsibility, to rebuild his life piece by piece, without expecting me to fix everything. I felt a mix of pride and hope. Watching the clouds spread beneath me, I realized that the sky was not just a vast expanse above. It was a symbol of possibility, of freedom I had long postponed. Seattle greeted me with the cool, salty air of the Pacific, a gentle reminder that life could still surprise me. Tom was waiting at the gate, holding a bouquet of yellow roses, and in that moment, I felt seen not as a caretaker, not as someone's mother, but as Hazel, a woman who had carried her own story and was finally stepping into the joy she deserved. The days that followed were filled with quiet mornings, long conversations, laughter, and the kind of gentle adventures I had forgotten could exist. Each evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, I reflected on the lessons of the past. I realized that unconditional love is powerful, but without boundaries, it can become a trap. Standing up for myself had not severed my connections with Daniel, it had given him the space to grow. And in my willingness to choose my own happiness, I rediscovered a life rich with possibility, one where love and self-respect could coexist. By the end of that month, I felt something I had not felt in decades, complete peace with my choices, with the past, and with the person I had become. I understood that age is not a limitation, that joy is not a privilege reserved for the young, and that it is never too late to claim your own life. I had left the invisible version of myself behind, and in its place, I found a strength, a clarity, and a serenity that I had long believed were lost. Looking back on everything, I realized that the most important lesson I learned is that it is never too late to choose yourself. Love does not mean giving until you are empty, and motherhood does not require invisibility. Standing up for myself that night, setting boundaries with Daniel and Kendra, was not an act of anger or revenge. It was an act of survival, of reclaiming the life I had put on hold for too long. I want anyone listening to remember that your happiness and peace are worth protecting. Sometimes, it takes courage to step out of the roles you've been expected to play, to put your own needs first, and to allow yourself to experience joy without guilt. I am 70, and I am finally living the kind of life I once only dreamed about, filled with choice, connection, and unexpected love. If my story resonates with you, I hope you take a moment to reflect on your own life. Are there places where you have allowed yourself to be invisible? Or times when your kindness has been taken for granted? Share your thoughts, like, and comment. Because sometimes sharing our stories can help each of us find the courage to step into the life we deserve. This is my story, and I am choosing joy. Will you choose yours too?